Ready to roll. So, hi, bonjour.
Hi. On behalf of Dairy Farmers of Canada, thank you for being here at our press conference.
Of Canada. My name is Lucie Boileau, and I'm the
Je suis
director for Dairy Farmers. Mon nom est Lucie Boileau, je suis la directrice des communications, et je vais animer cette
and I will be facilitating this press conference.
thing. So there's simultaneous translation. So get your headsets from here. Channel 1 is English, Channel 2 is French. And this press conference would also be webcast live. Alors, la conférence de presse va être diffusée.
So the press conference will be webcast live.
So, as you can see, we have a very, very good representation of dairy farmers across Canada this morning, including our president, Monsieur Pierre Lampron. Alors, comme vous pouvez le voir, nous sommes choisis.
So as you can see, we're spoiled because we can count on the presence of dairy farmers from all over Canada, including our president, Mr. Pierre Lampron.
With us of two people. So Mr. Ben Jensen, who is the chair of the BC Milk Marketing Board. Ben, where's Ben? He's right there. Et Monsieur Alexandre Giguère.
And Mr. Alexandre Giguère, who is the president of the Chamber of Commerce of the Association of the Traders of the CSN.
Friends. Donc, nous allons donc.
So let's start with a statement by Mr. Lampron in French, to be followed by our Anglophone spokesperson, Mr. David Wins, and each of the provincial representatives will speak after Mr. Wins. And after that, we'll take your questions.
French by Monsieur Lampron, our president, which will be followed by our English spokesperson, Mr. David Weens, after which each provincial representative will make a brief statement, and after that we will welcome your questions. So we'll start with Monsieur Lampron. La parole est à vous.
The floor is yours, Mr. Lampron. Good morning, everyone. My name is Pierre Lampron. I'm a dairy producer from Saint-Boniface in the Mauricie in Quebec. On behalf of 220,000 Canadians working in the dairy industry and in different communities across Canada, thank you for being here today. Times have been hard for the dairy sector recently. Dairy producers, their families, as well as dairy farm workers and processing plants are currently highly stressed because of the uncertainties surrounding their livelihood. The work we have been doing our whole lives seems to have been reduced to a mere bargaining chip during trade negotiations. And after.
Le dernier exemple. Aujourd'hui, nous avons deux objectifs. Premièrement, nous voulons parler des mythes et des
Okay, today we want to debunk the myths and the falsehoods about our sector. And we want to ensure you, we want to make sure that Canadians understand the value that dairy products bring, that Canadian dairy products bring, and that our sector also brings to Canadians and consumers. Secondly, we want to add our voice to that of Prime Minister Trudeau by stating that the dairy sector is worth defending. The Canadian dairy industry, thanks to our supply management system, is among one of the best Canadian success stories of the last 50 years. The dairy industry is one of the two main agricultural sectors in 7 out of 10 Canadian provinces, in addition to employing hundreds of thousands of Canadians. This sector is contributing more than $19 billion annually to Canada's GDP and is generating $3.8 billion in tax revenues to federal, provincial, and municipal governments. But the key thing is that today, Canadians have access to Canadian milk. Our milk is produced according to the highest North American standards in terms of quality, animal care, and environmental care. And we respect these high standards by ensuring that consumer milk prices are comparable to prices in other countries, and in fact, our prices are more affordable than in many countries. The Canadian approach to managing the dairy sector consists in ensuring that milk supply corresponds with domestic demand. and this enables producers to receive a fair price that covers our production cost without having access to subsidies that would be paid for by taxpayers, as is the case in the United States. The U.S. administration wants to replace Canadian dairy products and the Canadian dairy industry with American interest by weakening the pillars of our Canadian system. Many American dairy producers know that increasing their access to the Canadian market is not a viable solution to American overproduction. And the Canadian dairy sector is already meeting the needs of Canadian consumers. There are more people in California than in all of Canada. For American producers, the Canadian market is a drop in the bucket. But for us, this market is our livelihood. Canadian dairy producers have already paid the price as a result of the latest trade deals with Europe and the Trans-Pacific countries. Those trade deals represented a loss of $250 million annually in dairy production that has been lost to producers in other countries. This situation will not only hurt Canadian dairy producers, equipment dealers and the producers of animal feed, as well as veterinarians and truckers, not to forget processors, will all be negatively impacted by these deals, which will have long-term effects on the whole Canadian economy. All these losses amount to $2.5 billion over 10 years. Our message today is clear. The dairy sector cannot once again be negatively impacted by another new trade deal. Enough is enough. We are asking the government to ensure that any NAFTA deal does not negatively impact the dairy sector once again. Canadian dairy producers and their families, as well as hundreds of thousands of people who depend on the dairy industry in Canada for their livelihood, will be watching closely what the government does. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you, Mr. Lampron. David Wynn.
Hi, my name is David Weens, and I farm together with my brother and our families in southeastern Manitoba. We are third-generation dairy producers. On behalf of over 220,000 Canadians who are employed in the dairy industry in communities right across Canada, we would like to thank you all for showing up here today. This has been a difficult time for the Canadian dairy sector, whether in a dairy processing plant or on our dairy farms. The uncertainty surrounding our livelihoods is putting much stress on farmers, workers, and our families. Our life's work seems to have been reduced to a bargaining chip in successive trade negotiations. NAFTA is only one of the most recent examples. Today, our objective is twofold. First, we want to address several myths about inaccuracies that have been said about our sector. And we want to make sure that our fellow citizens understand the value that the Canadian dairy sector brings to consumers and Canadian families. And secondly, we want to add our voice to that of Prime Minister Trudeau. The dairy sector is worth fighting for. Canadian dairy, thanks to our system of supply management, is one of the great Canadian success stories in the past half-century. Dairy is one of the top 2 agricultural sectors in 7 out of 10 provinces. In addition to employing hundreds of thousands of Canadians, it contributes more than $19 billion to Canada's GDP annually and $3.8 billion in local, provincial, and federal taxes. But most important, Canadians today have access to Canadian milk. Our milk is produced according to the highest standards for quality, animal care, and the environment in North America. And this care for quality, our animals, and the environment is done all the while ensuring retail prices of milk are in line with other countries, and in fact, in many cases, more affordable than many. Our Canadian approach to managing dairy ensures a Canadian supply of milk matches domestic demand and allows farmers to receive a fair price that covers the cost of production without the need for taxpayer production subsidies like those granted to farmers in the U.S. Clearly, the U.S. administration wants to replace Canadian dairy products and the Canadian dairy industry with U.S. interests by eroding the pillars of supply management of our Canadian system. Many American farmers know that more access to the Canadian market is not a viable solution for American overproduction. The Canadian dairy sector is meeting the needs of Canadian customers. Canada has a population that is less than the state of California. For American farmers, the Canadian market is a drop in the bucket. For us, it is our livelihood. Canadian dairy farmers in the sector have already paid the price of Canada's admission into recent trade deals with Europe and the Trans-Pacific countries, resulting in the equivalent of $250 million annually in lost milk production to dairy farmers, and that is lost to farmers from other countries. This will only hurt Canadian dairy farmers. From equipment dealers to feed manufacturers to veterinarians to truck drivers to processors, all are negatively impacted by these deals, which will have long-lasting effects on the Canadian economy. This equates to $2.5 billion in lost over a 10-year time period, and of course that is in 2018 dollars. Our message today is very clear. The dairy sector cannot be negatively impacted again by a new trade agreement. Enough is enough. We call on the government to ensure that any final NAFTA deal has no further negative impact on our dairy sector. Canadian dairy farmers, their family, all of our families and hundreds of thousands that depend upon the sector for their livelihoods will be watching the government's actions very closely today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ween. So we're going to go now to our provincial representatives, and we're going to start from west to east, so BC.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Dave Taylor. I'm a dairy farmer from the Comox Valley on Vancouver Island in BC. And today I sit here with strong support from our Premier Horgan, and Agriculture Minister Lana Popham, who even just last week had strong statements of support for supply management and the Canadian dairy industry, and I thank them for that. I'm proud of our Canadian-made supply management system. And supply management to the farmer brings stability, it brings predictability, and it brings a price for our milk that can cover our cost of production if we are efficient farmers. On Saturday morning, I fired up my tractor. I was about to feed my cows, and while it's warming up, I was listening to a pundit who declared that the price of Canadian milk was too high. And then he went on to say that supply management and the powerful Canadian dairy lobby was blocking NAFTA. And I say, rubbish. Who is this powerful Canadian dairy lobby? Well, it's people like me. And who am I? I'm a farmer, I'm a father, a husband, a small business owner. And together with my family, we're trying to sustain our land. We're trying to apply best animal practices to produce food for Canadians. Who else is this Canadian dairy lobby? Well, it's the people that work alongside me and their families. It's the person who comes and picks up my milk every second day and delivers it to one of 3 processing plants in the Courtenay area. It's the processor and the many employees who test my milk, who then package it or turn it into products like butter, ice cream, cheese, yogurt, and many other dairy products. It's the equipment dealers. It's my feed manufacturer. It's my veterinarian. We're all Canadians who want to preserve a strong, dynamic, robust dairy industry. And I believe that all of us together has a ripple effect through the whole Canadian economy from coast to coast. much greater than the 12,000 farms that we can narrow it down to. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Tom Kustra, and I'm a dairy producer from the Ponoka area, where I farm with two of my boys. And the point I want to share with you this morning is the concept that the American politicians see the access to the Canadian market as being a solution to their surplus production. This simply is not realistic. And we've even heard from American dairy producers who agree with that perspective. With 37 million consumers, the Canadian market simply cannot absorb the American overproduction. The U.S. industry is 11 times bigger than the Canadian industry. Canada has fewer than 1 million cows, 300,000 less than the state of Wisconsin, 800,000 less than the state of California. So even if the Americans were to replace every drop of Canadian milk, it wouldn't be the solution to their overproduction. Any additional access to the Canadian market just is not a viable solution to America's overproduction. And we continue to encourage our Canadian government to defend the industry, the Canadian dairy industry in its under the NAFTA negotiations.
Thank you, Tom. Over to Saskatchewan.
Good day to all. My name is Melvin Foth. I'm a Saskatchewan dairy farmer. Just want to point out dairy farms are family-owned and family-run, often with multiple generations working on the same farm. Canadian dairy farmers work 365 days a year, and we put in long hours ensuring that the best health and care for our cows and the best quality of milk for Canadian families. I and the whole industry, we care deeply about the health of our animals. On my farm, particularly taking care of my cows means they take care of me. Significant investments keep being made to do a better job on our farms with our cows. Canadian retail prices for milk are in line with those in other jurisdictions. Could be roughly around $1.50 a litre. Compare that to $1.57 in Australia, $1.77 in France, $1.83 in New Zealand, and $2.58 in China. It is true that American consumers can buy a litre of milk for maybe $1.12, but that milk may have been produced with the use of artificial growth hormone, RBST, a hormone not allowed in Canada. American consumers looking for RBST-free milk, they pay an average of $1.64 per litre. Any concessions to our market will result in Canadian consumers having less access for high-quality Canadian milk products on our shelves in Canadian stores. Thank you.
Thank you. David.
Hi again. The ongoing NAFTA negotiations are a concern to us. Every time Canada signs a deal and where there's access given, it's a little bit of us is given away, and it's now there's been 2 deals where that has happened, and it's like dying a death by 1,000 drops of milk. Canada gave up 3% to the Pacific countries in CPTPP, gave up 1.5% access to the Europeans, and just those 2 trade deals alone would wipe out the province of Manitoba in terms of all the milk that we produce. And that is on top of the 5% that was access that was given 20 years ago when the WTO first was created. So in my province, for example, in the past 2 to 3 years, there's been about a $300 million investment in terms of what processors and producers have done on farm. So we have processing plants that have renewed and expanded, and we have the same situation on farms. But if more access is given, this kind of investment and growth grinds to a halt. So these concessions do all add up. And today, Canadians have access to more imported products than do Americans. The dairy sector in Canada, again, it employs more than 220,000 Canadians. So it's not just on farm, but all the related activity that relates to, ultimately, to dairy. Any further concessions on supply management or access to our market will have an effect on these hardworking Canadians, their families, and of course in rural and urban communities where they live, while having no impact on the American market whatsoever.
Thank you, David. Over to Ontario.
Good morning. My name is Ralph Dietrich, and my family and I are dairy farmers in Mildmay, which is a small town in midwestern Ontario.
David, go closer to
Thank you. When I watch the news, I see American dairy farmers time and again telling the press that the problems facing the U.S. dairy farmers are due to their own overproduction, not Canada's system. The 3 states of Wisconsin, New York, and Michigan alone, just those 3 states, on a daily basis, produce more excess milk, surplus milk, than the entire province of Ontario produces in one day. They, the dairy farmers, do not blame our system, they envy it. Year over year, the trade balance between Canada and the United States for dairy products is in favor of the U.S. Canada imports 5 times more than the United States than we export to them. The reality is that as farmers, we understand the difficulty of making a living from producing milk. American farmers from California, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, New York, and others have clearly stated that the problem in the U.S. is the overproduction of milk, which weakens the price that farmers receive. To stay in business under their current system, American dairy farmers need government support from U.S. taxpayers. To stay in business, they need to continue to increase production, knowing full well that that will only feed the cycle of low prices. No one wins in such a scenario.
Merci, Mr. Dietrich.
Thank you, Mr. Dietrich. It's now Bruno Letendre's turn for Quebec. Hi, everyone. I'm Bruno Letendre. I'm the president of Quebec Milk Producers. And with my son, Marc-André, we have a farm in the eastern townships. We all know that the world is producing too much milk, especially in the U.S., where they've thrown away, just in 2017, 380 million liters of milk. And here, thanks to supply management, we're producing according to the standards of the Canadian market without any subsidies. Americans have access to the Farm Bill, and over 10 years, that is $1 trillion that they have access to. Canada is doing well defending its market, because if we sacrifice it, there will be less milk, less processing of milk, and less locally sourced products. As our president stated in the beginning, we have the highest standards in product quality, in traceability, and without any growth hormones, as in the other provinces in Quebec. We have support from all the political parties. They even took a break during the recent political campaign to support us. We also enjoy the support of all the agri partners. I thank the Canadian government for defending the supply management and for also defending Canadian values. Thank you for listening.
Merci. New Brunswick.
Thank you.
Good morning. Sorry. Good morning. My name is Rijn-Jan Dijkstra, and I'm a dairy farmer from Second North River near Moncton in New Brunswick, where my wife and I run a family farm operation with 3 of our 4 sons. We've been down this road before. The agreements with the European Union and the Trans-Pacific countries sacrifice the equivalent of $250 million annually in Canadian dairy production to other countries. These NAFTA negotiations threaten again to weaken our sector with little or no proven benefit to the other countries, industry, or the Canadian consumer. Will Canadian consumers benefit from increased imports from the US? Will they be cheaper? It is highly unlikely. When we look at the average price paid by the Americans for their dairy products, we observe that the American prices are higher than Canadian prices for most products. Butter, cream, yogurt, you name it. Only those living close to the Canadian border benefit sometimes from the lower prices. Thank you.
Thank you. Nova Scotia.
Hi to all of you. My name is Gerrit Damsteegt and I farm in Shubenacadie, Nova Scotia with my family, and I farm there with my employees and their families. It's a family operation. I emigrated to this country 30 years ago because of supply management. The reality is that there is a lot of economic activity and jobs at risk if Canada would give in to the US demands. And I can tell you, I've seen it firsthand. What happened to European farmers since the end of the dairy quotas in 2015. Despite the authorities' best effort to offer what they called a soft landing to farmers after deregulation, the transition to the market economy has been devastating. Overproduction leading to an increased large surplus of milk sold by farmers to processors at discount prices. And farmers who've lost their farms. And even now, struggling to make ends meet and losing hope. In Europe, in Australia, where they deregulated both of these places, suicide prevention is now at the forefront of concerns of dairy farmers. This is a reality. Thank you.
Thank you, PEI.
Good morning. Hi, my name is Harold McNevin, and I'm a dairy farmer from West Devon, Prince Edward Island. I also sit here with strong support for supply management from my provincial premier, Wade McLaughlin. I care deeply about my animals. Producing high-quality, 100% Canadian milk requires top-notch animal care and dedication. Canadian dairy farmers are bound by very high-level standards that respect animals, give them very nutritious diet, healthy living conditions, and good veterinary care. This enables me to ensure my cows are healthy. Canada has the highest standards in North America. Yet Food Freedom Day, the day when Canadians have earned enough money to pay for their food for the entire year, falls in February, within a few days of our American neighbors. Canadians have earned enough money in the first week of January to pay for the farmer's share of that cost. Canada is constantly in the top 3 countries for food affordability. Canadians want and appreciate the affordability and quality of Canadian milk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And our last representative from Newfoundland and Labrador.
Good morning. My name is Jeff Peddle. I'm a dairy farmer from Lethbridge, Newfoundland and Labrador. Dairy is a very important part of Newfoundland's economy. It is one of the largest, along with poultry. Trade deals that displace Canadian dairy with foreign dairy is not only affect hundreds of thousands of jobs, they also remove from our store shelves high quality Canadian-made milk and dairy products that adhere to some of the highest standards of quality, animal care, environment without the use of artificial growth hormone, RBST. We have heard consumer concerns about whether imported milk will be safe for Canadian consumers, and we listened. Canadian farmers are proud to follow and enforce the highest standards of animal care, animal health, and guidelines. Canadians appreciate their local sourced Canadian milk and appreciate that it's produced according to the highest standards for quality, animal care, and our environment. Let's keep it that way. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. So we'll now proceed to the questions from the media. So there are 2 roving microphones in the room. So I would ask that wait until you get the microphone in your hand to speak to it so that everyone hears your question. Please state where you're from, your name, and if you have a specific person that you want to answer your question. Donc, nous allons procéder à la période de questions.
So we have the question period upon us now. We have 2 roving mics. Wait for the mic to arrive to you so that you can ask your question and tell us where you come from and tell us your name and if there is one person you're directing your question to.
Here. Where are you?
Hi, David Jungren from Reuters. A couple of questions, I imagine, to Mr. Wiens. We're told privately by government officials that some concessions will be necessary on behalf of the dairy industry, but what are they telling you? Are they giving you any kind of specific indication as to where they want to see movement?
Yeah, so I don't want to be speculating because I know we've heard a lot of things, but we don't want to speculate. But one thing that is very clear to us is the Prime Minister's support for supply management and dairy in particular, and he's made it very clear that he recognizes the value of our industry, and also we have articulated to him very clearly that support for supply management, support for dairy means that there is no access given. So that's and we know that that the Canadian government is defending us in the context of these negotiations.
And do you have an action plan in mind in case the government does something you don't like?
Again, we're getting into the area of speculation. We hold our Prime Minister to his promise and his statement that he will defend supply management and dairy in the context of the NAFTA negotiations.
Thank you. Mike, over here.
Oui, bonjour, Philippe Vincent Foisy de Radio-Canada.
Philippe Vincent Foisy for Radio-Canada. My question is for Mr. Lampron and Mr. Letendre. Mr. Trudeau is not saying that he will wholly defend supply management as requested by producers and provincial governments. So are you not basically dreaming when you're saying that he'll be defending supply management wholly? Well, you know that there are negotiations going on, and Mr. Trudeau has reaffirmed the fact that he wants a strong and a thriving dairy industry for now and for future generations. So we trust that during the negotiations, we will preserve that. Bruno. If I recall correctly, Mr. Trudeau said without any negative impact. So if there are concessions, they will have a negative impact. So I'm counting on what he promised. So I think he will not make any concessions because if there are concessions, it means there were losses and there will be a negative impact. So to me, the message is clear. He said without any negative impact. To get there, there can't be concessions. Well, talking about compensation. The CETA program was highly criticized by producers who couldn't apply it, and their projects, whose projects were not accepted. We're still waiting to see if there will be some compensation for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. To what extent are you afraid of being abandoned by the government? Well, there again, the program was for farm investments, and the next program hasn't been announced yet. We did send in our applications, and I think they're open to addressing a program that will meet our needs, given the concessions that were made in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But as Gord just said, we want to meet market needs and have market revenues. Okay, thank you, Kelsey.
Kelsey Johnson from iPolitics. I want to ask about Class 7. The Americans have made it very clear that they want Class 7 gone. My understanding is that milk classes are enforced at the provincial level, so could somebody explain to me how the federal government can even offer Class 7 if they're all enforced by the provincial milk boards?
I can answer in French, and maybe another one in English.
And maybe Ralph, if you want to jump into, since Ontario started this whole thing.
Well, as you said, Class 7 is a class that was implemented by provinces, and it's a class that is intended to modernize our supply management system. This class has a lot of impact on our domestic market. Each country has specific products to defend, and for us in Canada, we have our supply management. Class 7 is part of that agreement, and that's it. Ralph.
Yes, Class 7 is part of our supply management, and as we've heard and appreciate the government's response with respect to that, and then they understand and appreciate the value of supply management to Canada in general, and that during the trade talks they're going to support. So our intention and understanding is that it's, and we appreciate the fact that they'll be supporting us.
I'd like to say further, too, that it was a few years ago that the Canadian government challenged us, to further develop the industry. And really, Class 7 is an innovative response by the Canadian dairy industry. It's an agreement that has been reached between producers and processors. As we know that, with the production of milk, the milk has components. There's a butter fat, there's a protein, particularly, and in order to meet the requirements of the Canadian marketplace for butter fat, then there's that surplus protein. So exactly, this program is something that is innovative to the industry, and it's integral to the industry. It works, and that is that is something that we see within supply management. We see how things have continually evolved over the last 50 years to respond to the market development of the day.
But I guess my question is, can the federal government unilaterally eliminate Class 7, or do they need the provincial milk boards on side in order to do that? Because my understanding is that it's enforced at the provincial level by the boards.
Correct. But again, we're getting into the speculation. So we hear some things being reported this way or that, other aspects of the trade as well, and we're not prepared to speculate. Again, I mean, this comes back to the Class 7 is an innovative development within the dairy, within supply management. It helps us to be able to produce to our domestic market, and we'll continue to do so.
Julie?
Hi, Julie Van Dusen from CBC. The government says every day that it defends supply management, yet you're all sitting in front of us and you've come from BC to Newfoundland. So I'm assuming you don't believe the government, but I could be wrong. So could you put up your hands if you do believe the government will defend your industry in the NAFTA talks?
So if I could respond to that. NAFTA, there's been other trade negotiations in the past, whether it's CETA, whether it's TPP, now CPTPP. We've always had a strong presence around the negotiations. And so it's important for us to continue to deliver the message of the importance of dairy to the Canadian economy, and that allows us to do it. And I know that as a government too, they support our presence and our visibility in terms of these negotiations.
But Donald Trump says constantly that 300% tariffs are slapped on some dairy products. So I'm gathering, is there any concern that Canada might have to give its pound of flesh on this?
Canada has a very strong position in that. In terms of market access, Canada allows over 10% tariff-free market access, and the U.S. is at 3% market access for their market. So, and the Prime Minister is very much aware of that, and so they have some very good arguments in terms of this trade negotiation.
So we've got Ralph, Garrett, and Bruno lined up to answer your question.
Yes, thank you for that question. I would just like to add that the fact that we're here from coast to coast, every province in Canada, as dairy producers, it's not to question or to belittle with the government. It's the exact opposite. It's to show our support and appreciation for what they're doing, and for this government to recognize that they have support from the western coast to the eastern coast in the dairy sector, and appreciation for what they're doing, and that we will work hand in hand with them in any way we can to help them support for the maintenance of the only proven system of producing milk in the world that works.
Garrett?
Thank you. Yeah, I believe that government certainly support us, and we want to show our support to government. But I'm here today to defend the dairy industry, but I'm also here today to defend that all of you Canadians are able to continue to buy a wholesome, good, nutritious product which is produced here in Canada. There is more at stake than just the dairy industry. It's all the industries beside me. And I look at the place where I come from. If dairy is not there, there is not going to be a lot left of that community. And for that very reason, it doesn't just affect me. It affects all of us. So I came here today to not just defend me, but defend every Canadian for the right to produce our own product.
Monsieur Letendre.
Mr. Letendre, thank you. Thank you for your question. It's very interesting. You know, the NAFTA negotiations are really atypical because of Mr. Trump, as you said. He wants us to dismantle Class 7, whereas the government has never passed legislation to stop any protein trade between Canada and the United States. So Class 7 is simply meant for us to be competitive, which our American friends don't seem to like. They are very selective. Mr. Trump is very selective in what he says. We know, we understand that. 300%, well, is for butter, and butter is a product that it's a product that can be preserved, so it's a dumping product. That is why there is more, the percentage is higher. So Mr. Trump is really picking his terms carefully. I understand that. Why are we here? Well, as Ralph said, we're here to support, to show support, because this is not the kind of trade negotiation we're used to. So we're basically showing that we're showing unanimous support for our government. Thank you. I would like to add to that, because the question is very good. As somebody said, we're also here to defend Canadian values. We're producing all over Canada. We have economic activities all over Canada. And I believe that Americans are basically attacking our Canadian values, the values of Canadian dairy farmers. Mylène Crête from the Canadian Press. Former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney told us last week that Canada has no choice but to make concessions in order to please Mr. Trump, because Mr. Trump wants to say that he won during these negotiations. And when we look at all Canadian dairy exports, well, it would be a very small amount to please Wisconsin producers. What do you say to that? Well, we could turn the question around. Well, a minute part of Canadian production, well, for U.S. producers is not minute. They are 11 times bigger than us. So I don't think we are a major issue on that score. Mr. Trump likes to throw around big figures, but without analyzing the situation. Every country is protecting some sectors of their production. Sugar production in the U.S., for instance, is highly subsidized. And we're doing something similar. I think Mr. Mulroney was trying to push the negotiations forward, but at our expense. All right. Over there. I would add that, as you know, let's say, well, right now, what has been considered in Canada, in CETA and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, well, are we going? That was 10 days of production. Are we going to concede 10 more days of production, and that will add up to a month of production? I don't think that the Canadian government gets up in the morning with the plan to please Mr. Trump. That is not our government's daily desire. Mr. Mulroney's comment, well, I would take it with a grain of salt and consider it just his opinion. To sign an agreement that wouldn't be good for Canada, to please Mr. Trump, I have trouble with that perception. Ralph.
Yes, thank you. It doesn't necessarily mean at the end of the day it's a deal that's good for Canada. And I think that's what we have to keep in mind. The deal is the mixture of everything, but the Prime Minister has also said that he will not sign a deal for the sake of signing a deal. He will not sign a bad deal that That's not in the best interest of Canada. We appreciate that, and the fact that we are a very strong, vital, and growing industry. We contribute a great deal economically to this country. We also, which seems to be forgotten so often, we are very, very real and vibrant in the social and rural economic infrastructure of this country. This country is vast, and despite the fact that most of the residents are in cities in this country, the rural infrastructure is such a very, very vital and important part. And the dairy industry across Canada, as Garrett said in his particular community, would be very devastated without dairy. And that's not just that. So we add a lot of value to this country in other forms, in addition to the domestic value that we add.
Thank you. And David Taylor from BC.
Yeah, thank you. I want to echo a couple of things as well, and that is that Canada has said over and over that they need to have a good deal for Canada, and that's why we are all here today, to hold the government to account. It must be a good deal for Canada. We believe that is no dairy concessions. And I want to echo as well from all across this table the aspect that how important dairy is across the country. In 7 out of 10 of our provinces, dairy is number 1 or number 2 when it comes to agriculture and economic activity. It is significant. We need to preserve our food sovereignty. We need to preserve dairy in Canada.
Thank you. Yep, go ahead.
Janet Silver with Global News. A couple of weeks ago, we went down to New York and we talked to a number of dairy farmers that echo what you're saying in terms of the hardships they're facing, and a number of them are closing down, most likely next month, because of oversupply there. But one of the things that they all said, they support to some extent supply management here in Canada because they understand it gives, for them, they see it as a way of getting a base price. At the same time, they're saying some of the blocks that came to them in the last couple of years to Canada has impacted them, and they would like to see some sort of access to help them. I know that you all have said that that wouldn't help. They argue it might help a bit. I'm wondering, is there any room, any wiggle room whatsoever in terms of NAFTA on the dairy side? And if the government, though they say they support, but has to give concessions, and dairy is one of those concessions, what impact would that be on your industry?
Well, thank you for the question. I've had the good fortune of traveling to several states and to speak to dairy farmers. And really what we did was we just tried to explain, what our system is and how it affects us as producers, and it affects our governments and affects our consumers. And when they understand that it works, then they say, the question I get asked is, well, will it work for us? Why can't we do it? Number one, I think, yes. I think it would have huge impacts on them. What they're looking at right now is they're looking at Band-Aids for a big problem. A little bit of this, a little bit of that is a Band-Aid approach that will not work. They need to look deeper. They need to look at what is the real cause of their issue. Their real cause is overproduction. It's too much. Whatever you want. You take any industry, any business, and it's a simple supply and demand issue, and that's all it boils down to. Whenever you have too much of something, you're going to be forced to sell it at reduced prices, and vice versa. If there's not enough, you're in a position to charge for extra prices. Supply management is a system that levels out that playing field, that keeps the prices fair and relatively constant. And it's one that allows us as producers, to continue to invest in our industry. If you want to look at the last few years, the investment in Ontario alone, nearly in the processing sector is nearly $100 billion. And that's for several reasons. Not number one, because they have confidence in the system. The fact that they make this investment in their plants and they can depend on a good supply of wholesome, nutritious product for the life of that plant to pay it back. Producers have invested enormously as well. We've got up to 2-year wait periods for contractors in the building process. And that's all because we have a system that allows us as agricultural producers to be able to look forward and to predict with relative security our cash flow. Not only does that allow us to make the investment, it allows our financial institutions, the confidence to lend to us. So we need to look at You know, why do we want to take apart and destroy a system that's proven to be working, a system, despite what you hear, that is not having the negative effects on our consumers, you know, that you hear. There's studies and reports out there, you know, that say the dairy basket for the Canadian consumers is actually not too bad. You know, in a lot of places, as has been noted, it's cheaper than other countries. So yes, it would help them a little bit, but the little bit that they would help would only be a temporary perspective unless they get the crux of the problem, and that's overproduction. They have to get that in line.
Okay, Garrett.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate the question, and I'd like to speak to my opening comments. Yes, from the United States, there are producers there. They would love to see a system like ours. As I stated in my opening comments, in Europe, they disbanded the quota system in 2015. What's happening today, that some of the large processors, and they are large, are actually putting a system in place themselves to control production. And that is for the very reason that they say this is not sustainable. This doesn't make sense. So for that very reason, even though government walked away from it, the industry themselves are saying, listen, we got to control this because we produce a perishable product. Class 7 has been mentioned many times. Let's face the music. Like, we are innovative. We are willing to invest, to do the same as what the rest of the world is doing. And that creates what Ralph speaks to, the investment, to use the components of the milk. So challenge us to be innovative and at the same time criticize us.
Right.
One other comment that I would just like to make on that question is that when you look at the size of the Canadian market to the U.S. Dairy industry, where they're 11 times bigger than we are. In fact, the state of Wisconsin produces more milk than all of Canada. So, when we talk about, well, would it be a little more access? Is it going to solve their problems? The trade balance already favors the U.S. by a ratio of about 3 to 1, and that evidently is not making a difference. So it always comes back to domestic dairy policy, and that's what needs to be addressed here. And dairy farmers there will say that, like, that is one of the biggest problems that they face here, and that Canada is not the reason for their problems there.
Okay, we're going to go for a last question in the room, and after we're going to go on the phone. So, Maxime?
Oui, Maxime Bergeron, La Presse, bonjour.
I'm Maxime Bergeron from La Presse. Hi, everyone. Put on your headsets. We're talking a lot about NAFTA and the risk of reopening supply management, but in terms of the outlets for Canadian products, thanks to CETA and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, what outlets have you seen for Canadian products so far? Can't that additional export compensate what Canada has lost?
Ces marchés-là.
Well, those markets, as we all know, we're milk producers, and we're producing also for processors, but we're looking at the figures, and whatever product we have on the European market is really limited, as I just said. Every country has their own protection measures. It's hard to break in. The idea is that when you access those markets, you have to compete with subsidized producers, whereas that's not what we have in Canada. We focus on the Canadian market. Mike, please. It's really limited, the outlet, the options we have in other markets.
D'accord. Donc, il n'y a pas de...
Thank you. In the absence of any other questions. David.
I'd just like to comment a little bit further. The amount of dairy produced around the world, there's about 8% that is traded internationally. So it's like Pierre says, it's actually a small amount relative to what's being produced around the world. So that is clear then that most of the milk produced is for domestic markets. And so that little bit that is traded internationally is an extremely competitive marketplace and a very difficult place as we see now around the world. And that is, again, that's getting back to some of the problems they're experiencing in the U.S., where they have very aggressively pursued export markets.
Thank you. So we're going to go and check over the phone if we've got reporters lined up, if they have questions. So Bell operator, do you have any questions lined up for us? Ça marche pas? Can you hear us? I guess not. Okay, fine. So any last questions from the floor? Okay, Kelsey?
There has been a major discussion point this summer. There's been a number of suicides in the Canadian industry as well as around the world. What is the stress level within your industry right now? And are you worried that the uncertainty around NAFTA, if this continues, will lead to suicides in your own industry here and guys quitting the industry? Sorry, it's a downer, but but
Ryan will take that one.
The realities in farming are just like the realities in any workplace. And of course, this is putting an awful lot of stress on us and on our successors. Last week, there was the young farmers demonstration in Montreal. 2 of my sons were there. For the mere fact, they feel the stress. What you see sitting here in front of you is mainly the gray area people, the older generations. They allow us to be, our younger generations allow us to be here. But the younger generation wants to be able to do it also in the same fashion as we have done it, with a certain amount of satisfaction and a certain amount of certainty that they can produce. And that is the one thing that is the stressor, the uncertainty. So yes, no question about it. At the same time, and that is why I'm here and I feel confident about it, the confidence that we have gotten from the government at present, from the Prime Minister, is still strong. And he says, and he continues to say, no deal for Canada otherwise, unless it is a good deal for Canada. And that's where we take a lot of strength from. Thank you.
Just a follow-up. The lines that Prime Minister Trudeau is using are the exact same lines that Prime Minister Harper and Ed Fast used when they negotiated the TPP. Defend the system. So there was a concession in CPTPP, and it's the same line. So I'm just wondering why you believe him. You seem to believe him more than you ever believed Stephen Harper, and I'm wondering why that's changed.
So I'll take David and then Garrett.
One of the things that we've really stressed and articulated that support, so we've defined what is support for supply management. Support for supply management then means that there is no further access given, because that would be a negative consequence. And so we've been very clear, and the Prime Minister has responded that you know, in an understanding way, that he will defend supply management. So that we will take our Prime Minister at his word. And further to your question, you know, our prices, our domestic prices, are also influenced by the world prices, and so this has been a more difficult year for our producers, but things are still sustainable. The most difficult thing is, you know, when you lose hope, and that's not just for the farmer, but you know, in talking to farmers from other countries, we've very clearly heard that when they stop seeing any hope of improvement, that becomes very, very difficult for producers, and so we continue to you know, make it known to our government, whether it's, you know, the Prime Minister or Minister Freeland and others, what supply management, you know, the value of it, what it means, and also how we, what we mean when we say, or when they say support for supply management in dairy in particular. That is exactly what we've articulated to them.
So we have Garrett and then Tom.
I would like to add something to that. This is not a typical negotiation. American demands are really exaggerated. What they're asking for is that they alone should win, and they should always win. What Trump wants is that Americans should produce milk for Canada. Trump wants the U.S. to own the Canadian dairy industry, and that's why I think that Canada will defend Canadian values. And that's really why this is a different situation. Garrett.
Thank you. yes, we are, working with the present government, and they have said they support supply management, but we have stated very clearly, and they know that, no negative impact. To your earlier question in regard to, the suicide rate or mental well-being, there is a lot of anxiety in the dairy community. As the chairman of the provincial organizations, the calls that I have received in the last half a year are a lot more than ever before. And I want to stress, as Ryan said, it's all the folks that are sitting here. The young generation is at home. And my own son is asking me, Dad, what do I do? And I think that's why we stand for. No negative impacts. Maintain the stability. That's why in the early 70s, supply management was created, because it was so unstable. It has worked. It has worked without tax dollars. So for that very reason, we will keep government to their promise of not trading us off.
Thank you. There's Tom lined up, and then Ralph. Tom?
You asked the question about the mental health, and certainly and the stress associated around the discussion of NAFTA and trade. And I can assure you that there is a lot of conversation around my breakfast table about this NAFTA negotiation. It does provide some stress at the family table. But having said that, two of my boys are still working the family farm, and I haven't acquiesced to the wife's desire to get out of the industry because the boys want to continue. And the reason they continue is because they have not lost hope in the industry. In the coffee industry, for example, we hear a lot the term fair trade. And what does supply management do for us? Supply management is fair trade in the dairy industry. It allows the dairy producer to get his equitable share from the commodities. So yes, there is stress under NAFTA. If we keep the Canadian supply management system, I hope that my sons can continue to farm without the stress level that the other dairy farmers across the world have. And when you talk about trade in dairy, the trade is built on the backs of the dairy producer, who are not profiting from that trade. The prosperity in trade in dairy is built on the backs of producers, and that I'm not. There are other parties that are profiting, but I can assure you the farmer in Australia, New Zealand, America, and Europe are not profiting from the opportunity to export trade dairy.
Thank you, Tom. And last word to Ralph.
Thank you. The question with respect to, why should we believe this government over previous with identical comments? A valid question. I think something, though, that is, a little different nowadays is that, supply management is not just good for us sitting here at the table and our children at home on the farms and the rest of our farmer families and friends. Supply management is also good for consumers. I think the consumers are becoming, first of all, they're more knowledgeable about their food. They appreciate and respect homegrown food. They want to know the conditions in which their food was grown under. As Canadians, Canadian dairy farmers, we stand second to none with respect to the quality of our food and the homeliness of it. So I'm comfortable and confident that the government is recognizing that, and hopefully our consumers are getting on side as well and saying, you know what, the supply management gig isn't just for a few farmers. It actually has some relatively and some benefit for all of us. So.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. That brings us to the end of the press conference. If you have further questions, please come to me, and we'll be organizing interviews.
This ends our press conference. Thank you again.